Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Squirrel Boy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Evil Con Carne on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Thunderfist Halloween Bash on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Whatever Happened to Robot Jones on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Steven Universe on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Uncle Grandpa on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the League of Super Evil on Cartoon Network. Next.
Coming up next, it's a Johnny Bravo Christmas.
Coming up next, it's a Scooby-Doo Christmas.
Coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
A Scooby-Doo Halloween special.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Adventure Time.
next, later,
On Cartoon Network.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Adventure Time. Later, more Adventure Time.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Adventure Time.
later,
Regular show.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Adventure Time with Fiona and Kate.
later,
A new Adventure Time with Fiona and Kate.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Almost Naked Animals.
Network, next,
Annoying Orange.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Ben 10 Alien Force.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
Coming up next, it's Billy and Mandy Save Christmas.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
The Billy and Mandy Wrath of the Spider Queen special.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Chowder. Coming up next, it's Chowder in Hey Hey, It's Knishmas.
next, later,
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Christmas in July.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
Codename Kids Next Door.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
up on Cartoon Network,
The exclusive preview of DreamWorks Dragons Riders of Berk.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next. Next.
next,
Dude, what would happen?
later,
Destroy, build, destroy.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
Ed, Ed, and Eddie.
Next.
coming up next, it's Ed, Ed, and Eddie in Jingle, Jingle, Jangle. Coming up on Cartoon Network,
A Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends Christmas special, A Lost... Coming up next, it's Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends in A Lost Clause.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Garfield.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next, Garfield Gets Real. Coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
Generator Rex.
coming up next, it's Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer. Coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Green Lantern, the animated series, a special one-hour premiere event.
later,
A new Star Wars The Clone Wars.
coming up on Cartoon Network,
Next.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Johnny Test.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Johnny Test.
later,
A new Adventure Time.
coming up on Cartoon Network, next,
Johnny Test.
later,
Ninjago, Masters of Spinjitzu.
Next. Later.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Looney Tunes.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Mad.
Later.
More Mad.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Mad.
Later.
Robotomy.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Mad.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Men in Black. Next.
More Annoying Orange.
Later.
A new Mad.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
More Annoying Orange.
Coming up next.
More of the bestest best friends.
On Cartoon Network's 20th birthday party. Coming up on Cartoon Network.
More Codename Kids Next Door.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
More Ed, Edd and Eddy.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
More Johnny Test.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
More Johnny Test.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
More New Level Up.
Later.
Adventure Time.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
More Regular Show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
More Regular Show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
More Regular Show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
More Regular Show.
Later.
Cartoon Planet.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
More The Looney Tunes Show. Next.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Adventure Time.
Later.
A New Mad.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Adventure Time. Later.
A new regular show. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Almost Naked Animal.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Next. Later.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Generator Rex.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Hole in the Wall.
Later.
Dude, what would happen?
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Johnny Test.
Later.
A New The Amazing World of Gumball.
On Cartoon Network.
A new Mad. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Mad.
Later. A new regular show. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Mad.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. A new Pokemon Black and White Rival Destinies. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Regular Show. Later.
A new Mad. A new regular show. Later. A new secret mountain fortified.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Regular Show.
Later.
Regular Show.
Up next on Cartoon Network, a new regular show. Later, the series premiere of Annoying Orange. Hey, that's me!
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A New Scan to Go.
A new secret mountain fortified.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The new series Teen Titans Go.
Later.
A New The Looney Tunes Show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A new sidekick.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A new The Amazing World of Gumball.
Later.
Adventure Time.
A new Amazing World of Gumball. Later, a new regular show on Cartoon Network.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A new Thundercats.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Regular show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Regular show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The regular show Halloween special.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Regular show.
Later.
Mad.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Regular show.
Later.
A new Annoying Orange.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Robotomy.
Later.
The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Scooby-Doo and the Goblin King. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Scooby-Doo and the Legend of the Vampire. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Scooby-Doo and the Samurai Sword. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Scooby-Doo Camp Scare. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next. Scooby-Doo, the mystery begins. Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The season premiere of Pokemon Black and White Adventures in Unova.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Secret Mountain Fort Awesome.
Hey, up next on Cartoon Network, the series premiere of Annoying Orange. Later, a new man. Orange, you excited?
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A sneak peek of Annoying Orange.
Later.
A new man.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
A sneak episode of Ben 10 Omniverse.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next. Next.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Star Wars The Clone Wars.
Later.
Thundercats.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Teen Titans.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The Amazing World of Gumball. Coming up next, it's The Garfield Show in Caroling Capers.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The Looney Tunes Show.
Later.
More The Looney Tunes Show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The Looney Tunes Show.
Later.
The Amazing World of Gumball.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The Looney Tunes Show.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack.
Later.
Johnny Test.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Tom and Jerry, A Nutcracker Tale.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Tom and Jerry meet Sherlock Holmes.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next. Tom and Jerry.
Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next.
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Total Drama World Tour.
Next. Later.
On Cartoon Network.
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 Coming up on Cartoon Network.
Next, what's new, Scooby-Doo?
Coming up on Cartoon Network. Next.
Young Justice.
Coming up next.
Steven Universe.
Later
Adventure Time.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
DC Nation.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Courage the Cowardly Dog.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Codename Kids Next Door.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Scaredy Squirrel.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Codename Kids Next Door.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Diary of a Wimpy Kid.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Tom and Jerry Tales.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Cartoon Planet.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
DreamWorks Dragons, Riders of Berk.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Ben 10 Omniverse.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Garage Band.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Almost Naked Animals.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
What's new, Scooby-Doo?
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
More What's New, Scooby-Doo?
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Ninjago, Masters of Spin Jitsu.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Ed, Ed, and Eddie.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Looney Tunes.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Lego Star Wars The Empire Strikes Out.
Later
Lego Star Wars Padawan Menace.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Tom and Jerry Blast Off to Mars.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Teen Titans Go.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
More Teen Titans Go.
Later
Anew The Amazing World of Gumball.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Anew The Amazing World of Gumball.
Later
A New Clarence.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Clarence.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Adventure Time.
Later
A New Regular Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Regular Show.
Later
A New Mad.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Mad.
Later
Annoying Orange.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Annoying Orange.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Annoying Orange.
Later
Mad.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Mad.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Almost Naked Animals.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Johnny Test.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Pokemon the Series XY.
On Cartoon. Coming up next.
Pokemon Black and White Adventures in Unova.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Pokemon Black and White Rival Destinies.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
A New Garage Band.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up next. A New Teen Titans Go.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
New Sonic Boom.
On Cartoon Network.
Coming up next. More Totally Wrong. Revenge of the Island.
Coming up next.
The Amazing World of Gumball.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
More The Amazing World of Gumball.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
More of The Amazing World of Gumball.
Later
Adventure Time.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Clarence.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
More Clarence.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
Regular Show.
Later
More Regular Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next.
More Regular Show.
On Cartoon Network. Coming up next, The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Teen Titans Go!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Teen Titans Go!
later
Clarence!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Incredible Crew!
later
Regular Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Regular Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A New Clarence!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Steven Universe!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Steven Universe!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Uncle Grandpa!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Uncle Grandpa!
later
Clarence!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Total Drama World Tour!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
The Looney Tunes Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
The Tom and Jerry Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
New The Amazing World of Gumball!
later
More of The Amazing World of Gumball!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Teen Titans Go!
later
Johnny Test!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Teen Titans Go!
later
Regular Show!
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Scooby-Doo! Curse of the Lake Monster!
on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Craig of the Creek. Coming up next, it's more Craig of the Creek. Coming up next, it's Total Dramarama. Coming up next, it's more Total Dramarama. Coming up next, it's The Amazing World of Gumball. Coming up next, it's more of The Amazing World of Gumball. Coming up next, it's Victor and Valentino. Coming up next, it's more Victor and Valentino. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go! Coming up next, it's more Teen Titans Go! Coming up next, it's Apple and Onion. Coming up next, it's more Apple and Onion.
Coming up next, it's a new Lamput. Coming up next, it's Craig of the Creek. Coming up next, it's The Amazing World of Gumball. Coming up next, it's Total Dramarama. Craig of the Creek continues next. Coming up next, it's a new Wee Baby Bears. Coming up next, it's Wee Baby Bears. Coming up next, it's We Bear Bears. Coming up next, it's Regular Show. Coming up next, it's Sherlock Gnomes. Sherlock Gnomes continues next. Coming up next, it's the premiere of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Coming up next, it's Puss in Boots. Puss in Boots continues next. Coming up next, it's a new Craig of the Creek. Coming up next, it's Rise of the Guardians. Rise of the Guardians continues next. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Early Man. The premiere of Early Man continues next. Coming up next, it's the Polar Express. The Polar Express continues next. Coming up next, it's Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Coming up next, it's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory continues next. Coming up next, it's Elf. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans. Teen Titans continues next. Coming up next, it's Adventure Time. Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders continues next. Coming up next, it's Twister. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and Batman, the Brave and the Bold. Scooby-Doo and Batman, the Brave and the Bold continues next. Chowder continues next. Coming up next, it's RV. Craig of the Creek, Capture the Flag continues next. Codename Kids Next Door continues next. Coming up next, it's Steven Universe. Steven Universe continues next. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Ella Enchanted. Teen Titans Go versus Teen Titans continues next. The Lego Movie 2, the second part, continues next. Coming up next, it's the new Teen Titans Go Slam Dunk Special. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go Space House. Coming up next, it's a new Teen Titans Go. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Legend of the Phantasaur. Coming up next, it's Star Wars, The Phantom Menace. Coming up next, it's Craig of the Creek, Capture the Flag. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Gourmet Ghost. Scooby-Doo and the Gourmet Ghost continues next. Coming up next, it's the premiere of The Never-Ending Story. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Monster of Mexico. Scooby-Doo and the Monster of Mexico continues next. Coming up next, it's Star Wars, Attack of the Clones. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and Guess Who. Scooby-Doo and Guess Who continues next. Scooby-Doo, Moon Monster Madness continues next. Coming up next, it's Shazam. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Stage Fright. Scooby-Doo Stage Fright continues next. Coming up next, it's Star Wars Revenge of the Sith. Coming up next, it's The Looney Tunes Show. The Looney Tunes Show continues next. Coming up next, it's a new Looney Tunes cartoons. Coming up next, it's Looney Tunes Cartoons. Coming up next, it's Looney Tunes. Looney Tunes continues next. Coming up next, it's Clarence. Coming up next, it's the premiere of the Peanuts movie. Coming up next, it's the Peanuts movie. The Peanuts movie continues next. Coming up next, it's the Smurfs. The Smurfs continues next. Coming up next, it's the Smurfs 2. The Smurfs 2 continues next. Coming up next, it's Scoob. Scoob continues next. Coming up next, it's the new Total Dramarama Special. The Total Dramarama Special continues next. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go Super Summer Hero Camp. Teen Titans Go Super Summer Hero Camp continues next. Coming up next, it's Total Dramarama. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Superman 2. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Superman 3. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go Beast Boys That's What's Up. Teen Titans Go Beast Boys That's What's Up continues next. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go The Night Begins to Shine 2. Adventure Time continues next. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Return to Zombie Island. Scooby-Doo Return to Zombie Island continues next. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Curse of the 13th Ghost. Scooby-Doo and the Curse of the 13th Ghost continues next. Coming up next, it's Big Top Scooby-Doo. Big Top Scooby-Doo continues next. Coming up next, it's Smallfoot. Coming up next, it's more new Teen Titans Go. Coming up next, it's Chill Out Scooby-Doo. Chill Out Scooby-Doo continues next. Tom and Jerry continues next. Tom and Jerry Tales continues next. Tom and Jerry Kids continues next. The premiere of Tom and Jerry Back to Oz continues next. The Tom and Jerry Show continues next. Coming up next, it's a new The Tom and Jerry Show. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go Island Adventures. Teen Titans Go Island Adventures continues next. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Shaggy's Showdown. Scooby-Doo Shaggy's Showdown continues next. Coming up next, it's Uncle Grandpa. Uncle Grandpa continues next. Coming up next, it's Batman. Coming up next, it's Summer Camp Island. Coming up next, it's The Amazing World of Gumball. Coming up next, it's Steven Universe. Coming up next, it's Adventure Time. Scooby-Doo and Batman, The Brave and the Bold continues next. Coming up next, it's Total Dramarama. Teen Titans Go Super Summer Hero Camp continues next. Coming up next, it's a new Looney Tunes cartoons. Coming up next, it's Looney Tunes. Coming up next, it's Craig of the Creek, Capture the Flag. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Superman 2.